Welcome to Iowa News and Views. My name's Joe Balcom. I'm the host of the program. Thanks for joining us. We've got a very interesting program tonight. We're going to be talking about domestic violence issues in our state. I hope you'll stay tuned for that. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to talk a little bit about the new platform of the Republican Party here in our state. You know, both the Democrats and the Republicans have now had their state conventions, and they're proceeding to get their platforms together and their candidates together for the fall elections. And it seems like there's a lot of really interesting things in the Republican platform that I'd like to share with you, just in case you're not clear about this. Now, we have the website for the Iowa Republican Party, and we're going to give that so you can see for your very own self some of the things that they have in their agenda this coming year. Now, I don't know where you're at on some of these things, but let me just go through a few of them that are kind of strange and interesting. First off, they suggest that we have no licensing or registration of any firearm. Well, maybe that's not a bad. No instant background checks. Now, everybody generally thinks you ought to have a background check. They're also encouraging any adult to carry a concealed weapon. Now, there are folks that believe that once we're all armed, we'll all be safer. I'm not sure that that's going to work for us. Immediate impeachment of Janet Reno. I wasn't aware of that particular plank. Abolishing the income tax. Certainly some folks would be interested in that. Abolishing the state's minimum wage. Heck, if you don't have any wages, it would be hard to pay income taxes. So maybe those two are connected. They also think we ought to scrap some of our federal agencies, including the Environmental Protection Agency, which protects our air and water and soil, as well as the Department of Education. And are you concerned about workplace safety? Well, they also think we ought to get rid of OSHA. Those are the folks that make sure we have safe workplaces. And by the way, we ought to turn all our human services over to charitable organizations. And charitable organizations certainly do their part. And civil rights protections for gays and lesbians, forget it. Ain't going to happen. They're against it. They're also for scrapping affirmative action and recent hate crime legislation, not to mention the reinstatement of the death penalty, even in those states that we're seeing some review of that. And hey, if you don't speak English, you're out of here. We continue to see English as the official language in their platform is something that we ought to pass in this state. This is the new compassionate conservative agenda of the Iowa Republicans. I think you ought to take a close look at it. Check out their website. There's all sorts of interesting things. I think they're out of touch, actually, and are controlled by some fairly extreme elements in our state, which kind of falls out of this platform. So take a look at it for yourself and see what you think. Our guests this evening are Monique DiCarlo. She's the director of the Women's Resource Action Center here in Johnson County, Iowa City, and Michael Shaw. He's the Youth Services Director for the Rape Victim Advocacy Program. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Sure.
Thank you. Our topic tonight is the discussion of domestic violence issues. When we talk about domestic violence, Monique, what's the realm in which we talk?
Well, I think it's important to kind of be specific that we're talking about intimate partner violence, and then even to be more specific that what we're talking about is both physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. It's not just the physical violence that can happen in intimate relationships, but it's also the emotional and verbal abuse as well as the sexual abuse.
So, Michael, what kinds of acts are people, in terms of specifically, what kinds of things do people do to other people in domestic violence situations? What are some typical kinds?
Well, generally we identify domestic or intimate partner violence issues as issues of power and control, in addition to sexual violence, which is included in the realm, can be included in the realm of intimate violence. There are physical assaults, emotional abuse can be considered in the realm of domestic violence. The threats, intimidation, uses of children as tools for taking power away from or abusing power. There are a wide variety of ways people choose to use their power to abuse other people, women in particular.
Mm-hmm. So it's principally against women.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
95% of the time, that's what our statistics tell us.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of, we have a lot of, it seems like a lot more attention has been focused on these issues recently. Monique, how prevalent is domestic violence in Iowa, and are we making any progress in terms of some of the new money coming in to address this question?
So I've been doing it for a long time. I think I've been doing this, this type of work for over 15 years. And I should say that I also work contractually for the Department of Corrections, and I'm a facilitator for a batters education group. And what I can say is definitely there's a change since I started doing this in '85. What we know is that over half the folks who marry will experience violence or abuse at least once in their relationship. And then that statistic is actually very specific to physical violence, so that doesn't even take into account the types of emotional abuse that goes on. And for the research, there's not been as much research to look at same-sex relationships, but we know those folks also will experience, about 25% of those folks will experience domestic violence also in their relationships. There's no reason for us to believe that that national statistic doesn't apply to us here in Iowa. And certainly when we look at the statistics of the service providers, both the batters education programs and the shelters and the crisis lines, we know that it is a problem here in Iowa as well.
That's a huge statistic. If in marriages 50%, there's some sort of domestic violence happening. Michael, in terms of the work of your agency, the Rape Victim Advocacy Program, what kinds of things do you guys do? What kind of services do you offer?
We primarily serve victims and survivors of sexual violence and their friends, families, loved ones dealing with the issues of sexual violence. So that's something that people would call in on the crisis line, or we have advocacy services that we provide going to the hospital or law enforcement. And if someone called in and they were dealing particularly with sexual abuse issues, someone in our agency would speak with them. If it seemed like it was an issue where they were dealing more with the domestic violence realm, that would be something we would refer. That's part of our service as well as to refer them to the Domestic Violence Intervention Program or other resources.
You know, when I first started doing this work, Joe, the one thing that I remember is that on our intake form, we never asked women coming to, and that was actually outside of Johnson County, we never actually asked about their experience with sexual abuse until the research started showing that there was a high correlation between, it was almost as if a service provider, if we thought if you were in an intimate relationship, you couldn't possibly be experiencing sexual abuse or being forced to have sex. And that's certainly part of what women do experience sometimes in abusive relationships.
Mm-hmm. Michael, you're carrying a phone with you tonight. You're on call for a statewide hotline. Tell us a little bit about that. I know that's something that you guys oversee.
I'm going to get the date wrong. I believe the statewide hotline started in the Rape Victim Advocacy Program began housing the statewide hotline in 1998, I believe. Right. Yeah, and it's services we provide to the state of Iowa. The crisis line number is 1-800-284-7821, and that's in addition to the services we provide for the 4 counties. So anyone across the state of Iowa that is looking for immediate services, immediate support, can call the crisis line and get referrals to support in their communities, as well as just crisis support.
So is that a pretty busy hotline?
We get a fair amount of calls. I mean, it depends on the time of the day, and the line is available to survivors, to service users 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we're always getting calls.
I bet. So viewers, if you hear the phone ring, it's Michael's phone, and he's got a call coming in, but he'll be back. Monique, what is the cause of domestic violence? If you got 50% of people getting married, getting into it with each other on this level, what's the basis of that?
Well, we've certainly seen a change, over the period of time that I've been involved with this issue. And I think initially we thought that it was a problem between the partners involved in the relationship or the family, and we kind of tried to look at what was going on for the family. But as we looked at the statistics and really began to understand the issue, we believe it's a cultural issue. It's the way people are socialized. So the cause is having a power conflict, or the abuser trying to control the other person. And there's lots of reasons that someone might use the form of violence or threats or intimidation or isolating somebody. A real common tactic that starts out in a relationship is somebody disguising the desire to control with love, or it's just that I'm really concerned about you, that's why I don't want you to have to work those late hours, or I want you to give up that job, or I don't want you to hang out with that group of people. And it seems like it's coming in a caring gesture when the issue is someone's insecurity and kind of masking that with a desire to have power and control. certainly there are some people who, from a treatment perspective, will provide kind of anger management and really see it as an anger issue. But the model that actually the state utilizes, all the judicial districts throughout the state are responsible for making sure that an educational component is provided. And that model really recognizes that it's a learned behavioral response that can be unlearned.
Great. It seems like people's desire to control one another it's been around for a while in terms of the culture, not only our culture, other cultures as well.
And there's certainly healthy ways to resolve conflict and to struggle for power, you know, to listen to one another and to respectfully hear what we have to say. But when we start to intimidate or threaten someone or put someone down, we're crossing the line.
So, Michael, it sounds like we're changing how we view the problem from kind of maybe this symptom or there's some dysfunction in the family or somebody's doing something wrong, and to this, it's kind of in the water, it's everywhere culturally, and we learn it. How's that, as a new model, how is it difficult to make that case to people?
I don't know how, if I can speak to that specifically. What I can speak to more is what is shifting in terms of how we deal with the problem is, for decades, centuries, it has been perceived as an issue of women working to prevent domestic violence, working to prevent something that's affecting them. And I guess one of the cultural shifts that's going on right now is that there's an effort to make men accountable and make men more active and change the culture of men that allow this culture, this learned behavior to continue to go on and say something about it and do something about it. So I think maybe that more in the more recent times, there's the cultural shift with men becoming more active and programs that are being implemented to do something about domestic violence and sexual violence.
So, Monique, how do we get men's attention on this issue? You know, you kind of go through the courts, you get in trouble, and with law enforcement is one way, I assume. You go through the courts and you're required to do something, counseling or education. What other ways are we getting men's attention?
Well,
or is that the primary way?
Yeah, that seems to be the primary way, that you're court ordered into a program. And it's both men and women who are convicted of domestic violence, but like I said, that what we know is that 95% of the time it's a man abusing a woman. But same-sex folks who are in same-sex relationships can experience this too. I think that we need to make sure that there are still laws and still community response models in place, so that it's not just police officers' responsibility to go out, but neighbors calling when they hear something. If you're in synagogue or church with somebody and they're talking about this issue, make sure that we're educating people about it, and that those leaders of those institutions, if you will, know how to respond to someone who reaches out for help. So clearly I think there's still a need to kind of make sure that we're holding people accountable legally and that the services are available to them. But I also believe very strongly that it can't just be shelters or police officers or the criminal justice folks' responsibility to respond to this. All of us have to see it as our responsibility, and only when we do will we really make change.
So like when corrections and shelters, they're dealing with the issues of domestic violence after the fact. And when people have labeled that prevention, that's not really prevention, that's intervention or trying to support survivors or sending men to batterers education programs. In an effort to end domestic violence and end sexual violence, there should be, we've talked in this state in particular about a committed progressive effort to prevent sexual violence, prevent domestic violence. And there's a program that's starting to form around the state now, at least looking at it, called Mentors in Violence Prevention, where we're talking about men actively working to end domestic violence and men actually actively challenging other men in leadership capacities, talking to men about their roles in their relationships and interrupting rape jokes and interrupting situations where they look like violence might occur. So really talking about active efforts to prevent it and end sexual and domestic violence, rather than just the support that is very important, but making an effort to make some steps towards ending it.
That's great. It sounds like a very important program. I'd like to come back and talk about that in a minute, a little bit more detail. You're watching Iowa News and Views. We're just past halfway point in the show. If you missed the beginning of the show, We had a little talk about the Republican platform, and let's throw that website back up there, Nathan, if we could. It's quite a platform indeed. We're all going to be armed under this new, if the Republicans have their way, we're all going to be able to carry concealed weapons, and won't that be a heck of a good day? And who needs a minimum wage? We're already a low-wage state. What good's the minimum wage? We need to raise the minimum wage, not eliminate the minimum wage. Check it out. We also have a website you can take a look at, and we also have an email address. If you have any ideas about who you think ought to be on this show, or if you want to come on the show, send me an email, and we'll see that comes about. We'd like to know your thoughts about what we're up to here. Our guests this evening are Monique DiCarlo. She's the director of the Women's Resource and Action Center here in Iowa City, and Michael Shaw. He's the Youth Services Director at the Rape Victim Advocacy Program, also here in Iowa City. They're two people working in the field of domestic violence. One of the programs you just mentioned, Michael, was the Mentors program, Mentors in Violence Prevention. Talked a little bit about that. Monique, give us a little more background.
The reason I'm really interested in seeing this happen locally, but it's kind of, like Michael said, it's kind of serendipitous that there are pockets around the state where folks are already looking at this program too, and it's kind of exciting. But what really appeals to me is that it approaches men especially as bystanders rather than as potential perpetrators. And we know that the majority of men aren't perpetrators. Some are. But when we in the past have tried to do education around these issues, oftentimes our tactic or strategies sometimes have been at kind of trying to get at the message about what they do that might be hurtful or harmful to other people. And that often raises defensiveness. And what I like about this project is that there'll be the potential for folks as a bystander to learn how to still be cool and to still be themselves, but to interrupt something or to kind of bring up the subject with a friend or with a peer group, whether that's here at the University of Iowa, to do that in a residence hall with a team or within a fraternity. And certainly the program will be useful to young women as well, but I don't know, maybe you can talk a little bit about what we hope to do.
Well, there are a lot of things in the negotiation stage, but we're trying to connect with the university and try to provide some of the mentors and violence prevention approach, and hopefully getting that into youth programs, into school systems, to have mentors, people that are going through the training. We actually have a training fairly soon where people that are going through the training, the athletes that are in leadership roles and people in universities that are in leadership roles will talk to youth or talk to their peers and set up programs in their communities where they're talking to each other about violence issues, intimate partner violence issues.
What kind of curriculum right now do schools have, Michael, on this issue, or elementary or secondary schools? Is there any discussion about these issues? Or?
There is. It's interesting. There is some discussion in elementary school, and as they go up through the grade levels, there's less discussion because there's more freedom of choice in selecting their programs in the high schools. So there's a family life program in the elementary schools where they talk a little bit about relationship bullying type issues. In the junior highs, they have personal development classes where they talk about relationship violence and healthy relationships. And then in the high schools, there aren't really any established programs there. But the health teachers and the counselors on their own will bring in people to talk about issues related to healthy relationships and partner violence.
They do everything they can, but I think it's fair to say, I don't plan to make enemies with this, but I do believe that it's hit or miss, depending on who the school, depending on the community, depending on who's in the school. And actually, the legislature addressed this issue, and I want to say it was in '93, and I might have my dates wrong, it might have been '92. But the legislature mandated that the K through 12 curriculum address this issue, specifically address domestic violence, and not necessarily talking with kindergartners about what's happening in their home, but to kind of talk about it from a perspective that gives them the ability to know what it means to be safe, or to know what it means to not hit other people or to treat people respectfully. And there was a lot of work done at that point. It's just, if you talk with teachers, it's hard to kind of get to the reading, writing, and arithmetic, and sometimes they feel overwhelmed with this issue. But it'll take all of us, partnering with schools, people who, from programs like the one Michael's from, or mine, that are willing to go out and come into the classroom and help assist the teachers. And it's real clear what happens, I think, is that you're more likely to see kind of mediation programs, which are great ways to teach people how to resolve conflict in a peaceful manner. But what I'm concerned about is that there's not a program that specifically helps and encourages kids to talk about domestic violence or dating violence.
So we're talking a little bit about the broader community piece. How effective is the more structured programming that goes on for people that get in trouble with law enforcement? They do groups, and how effective is that? Is it, or are people very defensive and not really getting it at that point?
Yeah, I've been doing groups mostly with men. I've done a few with women that have been convicted or charged with domestic violence, and there's very little research on. There's some, and I'll talk about that in a second. But from my own personal experience, and just looking at some of the literature, we know that it's much easier to encourage people to stop using physical violence, but it's much more difficult to get them to stop using the emotional control and emotional abuse in relationships. So one study would suggest that over 80% who've been through a group program were able to stop using physical violence based on a self-report, police reports, and the victim's report. But only 20% were able to stop using emotional control and threats and put-downs. And this is different than just kind of I don't want to say normal, but a power struggle in a relationship that all of us have. These are folks who are kind of crossing that line and trying to control the other person.
So are there any statistics where you said approximately 50% of people that get married have some form of domestic abuse going on, whether it be emotional or physical? What kind of caseloads do people have around the state in terms of number of people that get in trouble with courts and then find their way into these programs? Do you guys have any sense of that?
I have a little sense. I mean, you might have a sense of the number of people calling on the crisis line and who RVP serves, but I know that if you look at what the shelters, either an individual shelter or total throughout the state of Iowa, and then look at the Department of Correction, again, was legislated to respond to provide domestic violence services. They don't necessarily directly do that in all the communities throughout the state. Some of them contract with mental health centers. Here in Johnson County, in the 6th Judicial District, they actually provide it themselves and hire people to come in and work on their unit. Their numbers are, in Johnson County, about 200 a year. I know that the domestic violence shelter here serves over 1,000 people a year. So if you compare it, you know that we're not reaching all of the folks that need the help. And so the crime is way underreported.
And I'll just agree with that. And just, I don't have the specific numbers right at my fingertips, but we get a significant number of calls on the crisis line from family members and survivors and their friends and loved ones, and we get them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we get them all times, and we are heavily supported by our volunteers to be able to provide those services, and we're constantly trying to get more volunteers because the load is so heavy.
Let me put you both on the spot. In terms of a report card, if you're going to give our state a grade, A to F, 5 years ago, what would it be and what is it today on addressing this question?
You mean services for the perpetrators?
How many resources we put into it and services available, all that. How do you think we're doing?
5 years ago?
Yeah.
I'll go first. You can be thinking.
Okay.
I would say that 5 years ago, C+, and I would say a B, sometimes a B+.
All right.
I could probably say 10 years ago better when Bonnie Campbell was around, and we're closing in on, we'll see. I have a sense that there's been some ebbs and flows, and I guess currently, with the status of the state now, we're in our forward looking, I would give it at least a B+, and how we're the state and all efforts around the state are looking towards dealing with issues of domestic violence and where they are.
Great. We're down to the last couple minutes. Any final comments on how people can get involved in this issue, Michael?
Support services that are being provided to survivors and supporting the Victim Advocacy Program, the Women's Resource and Action Center, the Domestic Violence Intervention Program, the youth programs that are dealing with issues, volunteering for those programs, getting involved in mentoring programs, getting involved in programs and saying something loudly about programs that are working and getting men involved in programs that are working and could be effective in ending sexual violence and preventing sexual violence.
Good, thanks. Monique?
I would say that if your community doesn't have a community coalition that addresses domestic violence, call the Domestic Violence Program and see how you can help start one. We have a really active and a great one here in Johnson County.
Great. We have a little bit of contact information coming up here at the end for both of our guests, so you can take that down to get some more information. Thank you, Michael and Monique, for being our guests this evening.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
You've been watching Iowa News and Views, Iowa's longest-running public access series seen statewide. I'm the host, Joe Balcom. Appreciate you joining us. Remember, what's important is what you do every day in your community to make it a better place. This is, of course, just a TV program, and up next, the Home Shopping Network. We'll see you next time.